Welcome back to another episode of the Housing Collective podcast. My name is Tom Neely, Director of Meatmall Search, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Ian McDermott, Chief Executive of Peabody. So Ian, thanks ever so much for joining us today. For the listeners, could you give us a brief introduction to yourself and your organisation?
Okay, well, let's do that in reverse order, shall we? So Peabody, a large organisation, 108,000 homes based in the capital, established by George Peabody back in 1862 with the objective of ameliorating the conditions of the poor and needy within this great metropolis and promoting their happiness and comfort, which is not a bad opening statement, really, for any organisation. As I say today, much bigger. 75% of our homes are in London. We've got homes in the northern home counties and the southern home counties through a subsidiary Town and Country. For me personally, I've been the chief executive for coming up for 3 years. So we are a product of a merger between Peabody and Catalyst to form the modern day Peabody. The objective of that merger was to create a large organisation that had the infrastructure to invest in things like an academy, in terms of data and IT, but also to try and to create a local model where we invested very heavily in the localities, which might sound like a contradiction, being a big organisation in order to focus on local areas. But that's the objective that we've set ourselves. That's the mission we've been on for the last 3 years and that we continue to pursue.
Brilliant. And on that, Ian, like you say, we'll pick up on a few of those points during the session. But I guess Peabody has a fantastic, rich history and quite an interesting story. But so do you, as your own personal career as well. So can you share with us a bit about your journey from a number of years ago right through to present day of becoming that chief executive?
So back in the day, I was Director of Development at a Housing Action Trust in Harlesden in north west London, and then became Chief Executive of that very small organisation, so 900 homes, a big regeneration project, working really closely with communities. I then took a role as Chief Executive at Shaftesbury, and Shaftesbury was a sort of medium-sized housing association. Got itself into a bit of a mess, frankly, for all sorts of reasons. And about 6 months into that, it was clear that actually we needed to seek a merger. We then joined, after quite a lengthy process, actually, we joined Sanctuary, which is a big national provider, similar size to that Peabody is today. And I became Chief Operating Officer ultimately at Sanctuary. Sanctuary took in a lot of organisations. It sort of developed a reputation for being able to support and solve quite complicated problems that organisations had got themselves into, most notably and most headline-grabbingly was Cosmopolitan. So I was there for about 8 years in total. I then decided I needed to move back to London for personal reasons. So I took a job as chief executive at Aldwick. Aldwick was a 11,000 unit association based primarily in Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire, with what is now our kind of northern home counties footprint. There for about 2 years, got the job at Catalyst, where I was chief executive. Aldwick decided that they wanted to follow me into Catalyst. So eventually there was a merger of those two organisations. And then probably earlier than we would have chosen, we had an approach from Peabody. Peabody wanted us to consider a merger between the two organisations. It felt uncomfortably soon after the last merger at first, but actually as we started to unpack the possibility that might be unleashed by bringing the two organisations together, we concluded that actually that was the right thing to do, and that takes us bang up to date. I think from a personal point of view, I'm a chartered surveyor by profession, and I think that's about me.
Yeah, definitely. And like you say, when we spoke offline, Ian, it's quite nice that you've done that full circle around regeneration as well. So
which is
really interesting.
So back in the day, I missed this bit out because it was already long enough. But pretty much the first job I did was working in the London Borough of Waltham Forest, and there were 4 estates there that ultimately became the Housing Action Trust in Waltham Forest, different from the Stonebridge Housing Action Trust that I just mentioned. That was a really interesting project where we were looking at taking the sort of brutalist 1960s and 1970s slab blocks down and replacing them with medium density, gentle density in modern parlance blocks, and working really closely with residents to make sure that was possible. That became a Housing Action Trust. And the full circle of that is that those 4 estates are now with Peabody. So, and one of the highlights really of my professional career is realizing that I still had the phone numbers of some of the residents from back in the day and ringing them and having a kind of reunion, which was great. So, yeah, a real journey really. So, I mean, 30 years ago, working on those 4 estates now, kind of being reunited with the residents, it's just, a really interesting story.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. I love talking to you about that when we spoke offline. So you talk about Sanctuary and clearly your journey as well, Ian. I wanted to pick up, clearly it is very prevalent in the sector at the moment, the topic of mergers. So during your time as COO at Sanctuary, you were clearly, as you rightly said, involved in many a merger, particularly the well-documented Cosmopolitan. So, and arguably the regulator saw Sanctuary back then as a safe haven for kind of troubled organisations. And when you look back at that time, what do you think some of the most crucial points in the first 100 days are when you're stabilising a struggling organisation and bringing them into your own?
Yeah, sure. So I think you have to understand the pressure points that organisations got themselves into difficulties, challenges, Cosmopolitan, and there's usually 3 or 4 fairly standard reasons for that. There's an index-linked lease at the bottom of all of this, or there's a chief executive with a big ego that wants to prove that they can do X, Y, and Z and actually step outside of their skill zone and the organization's capacity. So there's a number of different reasons, but if I'm honest, those 2 things actually probably define quite a few of the organizations that came in. So what's really important is you just have to understand where the risk is and what's important. So for Cosmopolitan, actually, Secretary took a very different approach from those other organisations that had looked at it. We understood that there were these sort of poisonous leases that were at the root cause of the problem. And I think others that had looked at it were trying to work out a way of getting rid of them. Whereas what we did was to manage through them and actually leave them in place. And as the opportunity arose, we were able to step out of them and bring those in. So it's that sort of understanding where the risks are. We needed a particular permission from Chester and District Council, and so we went there and we got that before we did anything. And then just kind of reassuring the local team. So, it's really... So most organisations that get themselves into difficulties, the thing that is that the people on the front line, the people doing all of the work, are actually every bit as good as anybody you employ. And you just need to steady the ship. You need to get their confidence that actually this isn't simply going to be us clearing people out and replacing them. There are some things that have to be done, but fundamentally you need to find on each of those mergers that we did, we found somebody from within the organisation that we'd taken over, and put them in charge. So that it was a familiar face, a reassuring face, somebody that understood it, but somebody that we had the confidence, understood the essence of what we were trying to achieve, and could help us navigate a way through that. So that's a sort of a rescue merger. And they tend to fall into 2, don't they? There's a sort of rescue merger, and then there's a merger of choice where you've got 2 similar-sized organisations coming together.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess from your perspective in going through those mergers, and like I say, two very different mergers, and you've done both many a time. I mean, what do you see as the most common misconceptions housing associations and boards have when entering discussions like that?
Oh, well, all sorts of things, really. So I think the first, if I'm being uncharitable, quite often what will happen is you'll get the two boards together. Both will make opening statements about how residents are the most important thing, and then you'll go on and have an hour and a half discussion where residents aren't mentioned. So I think I think for those, and that's a sort of rescue merger. I think it's the sense of we've done nothing wrong and why is this happening to us that is the biggest barrier to making progress. Because if there's not, there has to be acceptance that something has gone fundamentally wrong. That's why you're there. And you have to get their cooperation and support in actually helping you to navigate the way through it. So that understanding of the reality of where you are and how you got there, I think is always challenging with a distressed organisation.
Looking back at the mergers that you've undertaken in, what's the one piece of advice you wish someone had given you before that first merger?
What's the one bit of advice? So I guess be patient. Don't sweat the small stuff. Stay laser focused on the things that need to be sorted and sorted quickly. And I think it's very easy to get distracted by other things that are wrong. And if you're solving all of the small problems, then you're in danger of not solving the really big problem that is the fundamental reason that you're where you are.
Yeah, and you've obviously gone through it. You will have seen and been involved in many organisational cultures and also culture change through that merger work. Looking at today with Peabody, how do you approach creating and maintaining the right culture at Peabody, particularly given its scale?
Culture isn't something that you sit down and write out and define. It is something that emerges out of your behaviour and the way that you conduct yourself as an individual. So and it's giving people the confidence that actually there is an absolute alignment between what you say and what you do. So that's the first thing is if you're saying one thing and doing something else, people will follow what you're doing, not what you're saying. And that's really important. Second thing is you have to get, I can't change the culture at Peabody. My executive can't change the culture of Peabody. It takes a kind of leadership team of 50 or so people to actually, and you need to get them aligned, understanding not just the words that you're saying, but the essence of what it is that you're trying to achieve. That has to be really clearly articulated. It has to be understood by all of the change makers, the attitude adjusters that are involved in that process. And that then percolates out. So, and you have to give confidence that you mean it. So when you're saying we want to devolve authority, if mistakes get made in that process of devolution, then obviously you talk to the people where things about what's gone wrong, but actually you do that in a supportive way that you demonstrate. All too often organizations get stagnate because people are fearful of making decisions, and with that fear, they then push things back up the organization. You have to be quite disciplined about saying, no, it's up to you. So you might have a quarrel or you might have a challenge externally, and you may have a view about how that's going to be done, but you have to have the self-discipline and the agility to say, it's up to you. You need to make this decision. It's your call. And sometimes people will make decisions that aren't yours, and sometimes they'll make decisions that turn out to be the wrong decisions. And you have to treat those two things equally. What matters is people are learning as you go through that process. They're learning how to make good decisions, but they're also learning that if they make a decision, you will support them, even if those decisions turn out not to have been optimal.
Thank you, Ian, for that. And just talking about leadership, and I guess I wanted to touch on your personal journey, Ian, because for someone who has achieved such significant success in your own career, you also done that whilst managing dyslexia. So can you just talk to us about how that shaped your approach to leadership and decision making?
I probably should have said that in introduction, actually. I mean, I think if I had to define myself as a person, dyslexia would always appear in the first sentence of that description. So, I think anybody who lives with dyslexia, particularly, severe dyslexia, which is kind of what I have, then it is life-defining in many ways. And it's not just your ability to spell restaurant, it sort of defines the way you think and your introduction to life. So I think it comes naturally with a degree of humility, I hope. I don't know that I'll be showing humility. Hopefully I'm showing humility throughout this interview. But you are quite often in the early stages where those mechanical skills are really important. You struggle. So it makes you quite resilient. That's the first thing, I think. The second thing is dyslexia is not a disability, really, in my opinion. It's a different toolbox, right? So I can tell you the time, the place, the moment when I was listening to the radio and a guy came on and started talking about what dyslexia was like. And it was like somebody was explaining my brain to me in a way which I'd never witnessed before. And it's some things just don't work. They don't work, and you can't make them work. And there's nothing you can do to train yourself to make them work. But there are other skills as well. So I think dyslexics come with a different toolbox. They're missing a few tools, and they've got some extra ones. So it's actually finding those extra tools, embracing those extra tools, understanding what superpower you have as a consequence. That's not very humble, is it? What superpowers you have as a consequence of missing some of the other mechanical skills that you need. So I think that's really important. The most important thing, and the thing that I say when people say, "Oh, my child has got dyslexia," what advice would you give me? One bit of advice only, and that is keep people's confidence. Actually, if you've got self-confidence and you can navigate your way through anything, and I never have quite understood why I've maintained self-confidence in when things are being particularly challenging, but I have, and that's been the thing that's enabled me really to navigate my way through. It gives you a very different insight into life and to kind of your individual relationships, but it also, as I say, it comes with some extra tools, and some of those, I think, I'm very comfortable with complexity and uncertainty. I can usually navigate my way through really complicated situations quite easily because I think in a dyslexic way, which is a kind of three-dimensional thing. So it was a problem at first, and I think it's been a benefit the more senior I've got within any organisation.
Yeah, I get that completely, because naturally, kind of going through that academia education must have been really challenging until, like you say, you then work into the workplace. And I guess on that, Ian, for those listening who do have dyslexia as well, I mean, what strategies have you developed throughout your career to work with rather than against dyslexia, as you rightfully say? But also, I was just keen to look at Peabody as a whole and how perhaps dyslexia may have influenced how you champion workplace inclusivity at Peabody as well.
Yeah. So I think, so the first part of the question, I think, was my coping strategies.
Yes.
I think the first thing to say is just be open about it and talk about it. It's really, that sounds simple and easy, but there are humiliations, there are really negative experiences that I've had in my life that I still find quite difficult to talk about, and that, and as you get more senior and more confident, you sort of let go of a little bit more, but there's still elements of it where I really struggle. So I'm one of 6 children. I was the only one that failed my 11 plus, which we had back in the day, where you got separated at the age of 12, and that was entirely to do with dyslexia. So you learn, but you learn kind of mechanical skills about, how not to get your B's and D's around the wrong way. You learn little sort of techniques to that. Never eat celery, eat 7 sandwiches and remain young, if you want to know how to spell necessary. But so you learn all of those things as a sort of mechanical skills. You have to, what I think is, it's those moments of, I am very form phobic, so I hate forms. I to this day have a sinking feeling whenever I've got a form that I need to fill in. And it used to be those sorts of things that were really difficult. And you sort of develop ways of saying, oh, I'll fill this in later, or I'll pick this up, I'll bring it back when I'm... And you learn sort of charming ways that you can avoid filling it in front of people, which is like the ultimate humiliation because you're going to struggle with it. So you learn lots of little techniques that you don't even realize are techniques. They're just ways of coping and ways of dealing with things that allow you to, to navigate your way through the perils of life, really.
Yeah. And I guess, and it's an inspiring story, and many people have said that to me who know you personally as well. I think it's fantastic, particularly given the role that you're in, and inspiring for those who also have dyslexia as well. So, and I guess I just now want to move on to Peabody, if that's okay, because you mentioned a statement at the beginning of our discussion, which I wanted to pick up on. So, Peabody aims to be big and local, which, as a strapline, seems quite contradictory in a global setting. So, talk to me about how Peabody maintain that local touch whilst operating at such a large scale as well.
So, the first thing is being local isn't just about being local. It's not just about having people within the locality, and it is about the whole organization pivoting and focusing. So your finance team, your HR team, all those central services, understanding what it means to be local and to create that as the DNA of the organization. So that sense of local. So it's about, the first thing we did was to break the organization down. We were trying to think through, what's a sort of medium-sized association, what size would it be where you could reasonably say it was local and it would still be viewed as such by its residents. And that's about 20,000, right? So that's kind of, I don't think there's a huge amount of science attached to that, but casting around, talking to people. So we broke the organization down into regions, put a managing director in charge of each of those regions. That managing director was responsible directly for certain services, but actually had a kind of matrix responsibility for everything that went on in their region. So they're responsible for the management of the relationships with the local authorities. They need to be absolutely clued up and aware when there's development going on. And then they need to manage the sort of day-to-day service. So the managing director becomes the kind of pivot point for the organization. Below that, you have probably a quite traditional structure down to neighborhood managers. We reduce significantly the patch sizes of the neighborhood managers, and that's kind of, so that's one element of it, actually, just an organizational structure with the MDs as the kingpins within that. And we've got 5 managing directors effectively across Peabody. But what's also really important is, so you've become big. We've now got a director of data, which we wouldn't have been able to have had we been a much smaller organization. That director of data is kind of producing management information and insight and understanding of our residents and of the buildings that are in each of those neighborhoods. That then allows us to create neighborhood plans based on the 140 patches that we have across Peabody. And this is still work in progress, right? So we've got that now, that structure is up and running. We're starting to develop those neighbourhood plans. We're engaging with residents at that very local level to make sure that those neighbourhood plans reflect what they're doing. And then there's a sort of cultural bit that goes with it. So that's the technology, that's the organisational structure, and then the cultural bit is about making sure that the culture does. Our most important people probably are our caretakers. They're the people that kind of interact with residents on a daily basis, who are based on site, who can't pick and choose whether they come in 2 days a week or 3 days a week. They're there. That's where they're based. And creating an environment in which the caretakers, the neighbourhood managers, are really the backbone of the organisation, have genuine authority, and know that if they make decisions about what needs to be done, that we will be there to support them. So there's a big cultural change piece that goes with it. And we've all had those big set piece cultural change programs. Ours is very much about not about kind of the big systems changes that we want to bring about. They're about making sure that those little differences locally, when you order a new lock for a communal door, the caretaker gets a key instantly and doesn't have to fish around. Those sorts of things are the things that actually will ultimately define you, making sure you get that sort of detail right.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, because it quite clearly says, and as you rightly say, kind of, it's a work in progress, as everything is. But I think the fact that the joys of Peabody, of the scale, it also gives you choice to create, and that financial viability to go out and, as you say there, create kind of this directive data team, which not a 20,000 unit RP may do, but probably may not be able to do it as a scale of what Peabody's done. So it's a really interesting kind of model, particularly whilst maintaining that locality, because as you said, it's the old Wick. It's making sure that that customer voice is still heard despite being in a 108,000 unit RP. So it's a fascinating business model. And just whilst we're on that, Ian, you mentioned 108,000 units. 73% of that stock is in London. So I want to touch around kind of some questions around London, if that's okay. And I read an article recently where, obviously, as your work as vice chair of the G15, I saw that you asked a question of going, which housing crisis? So could you just break down for me the multiple crises you see in London's housing ecosystem and how they all interconnect?
Yeah. Well, let me start in a slightly strange place. One of the things that I think it always annoys the rest of the country if you start talking about how troubled and beset the capital is compared to everywhere else. So just to acknowledge that every area has its own challenges. Those challenges are different in Newcastle, Sunderland, Chester, Kings Lynn, wherever you want to go there. So everybody's got challenges. So I'm going to talk about London because that's where we are based. But that's not to say woe is me. We have some advantages in London around the underlying land values that allow us to do regeneration that simply wouldn't be possible elsewhere. So let me just acknowledge that. So I think the first thing is there's a kind of quantitative problem in London. Half the people on waiting lists, 1 in 23 are in London. 1 in 23 children will go to sleep tonight in temporary accommodation and unsatisfactory and therefore unstable accommodation. The scale of the sheer shortfall in numbers is significant. The second thing is that there's a crisis of aspiration. So you have people like me who bought a flat with my mate when we first moved to London, and I bought it at the age of 22. Well, you would never be able to do that now. So those, so there's a sort of crisis of aspiration and people being locked out of the housing market in a way that simply wasn't the case historically. And you can see the average age of people buying. So that's a problem. There's a quality issue. You're twice as likely if you live in London to be overcrowded. So there's a real quality difference. You're less likely to have access to, statistically less likely to have access to open space if you live in London. So we have a much higher percentage of people living in flats. We know that people living in flats are generally in the round less satisfied than those people who are living in houses. There's a sort of density issue which sort of accompanies that. So I think financially, humanely, and organisationally, there is a significant crisis. There's also a real skills crisis in London. We commissioned a piece of work together with some of our contracting partners and other large associations in London to have a look at the skill shortages that we have in London, and they are enormous. They are eye-watering statistics. So just pick one. We have 76% of the surveying capacity that we require in London simply to do the job that we're doing at the moment and to deliver the plans that sit within all of our business plans. So before we start really ladling in, a significant expansion of new build, before we add in zero carbon and the retrofit that will be required as part of that, we simply do not have enough of the right skills in London to provide the housing that we want. So I think that the capital is in a really challenging position at the moment, and that's not to say that other areas aren't, but they are, they're just different challenges.
Yeah, and as you say there, you are, as Peabody, naturally impacted in all of those challenges as well. I mean, I wanted to bring up some quite stark figures for you, Ian, which clearly you'll know better than anyone. But when I was doing my research prior to this conversation, it was quite damning, to be completely honest. I was keen to get your thoughts. So, in a recent report that I read, it shows that there is a 4.4 billion annual funding shortfall for social homes in London. So just talk to me about without stating the obvious, what is the immediate impact that's having for Peabody, other organisations in the G15 to have the ability to provide much needed affordable housing?
Yeah, so talking to one local authority in London, so we've got 32 or 33 local authority, boroughs in London, depending on whether you include the city. And just talking to one of them, their temporary housing bill this year is going to be 58 million. It's swamping their housing revenue account. So 58 million and then times that by 33 gives you the scale of the challenge. So we are working with local authorities who are... So it's a bigger challenge actually for the local authorities than it is for us, because they have the ultimate responsibility for rehousing people and meeting housing need within their borough. Our job is to support them as actively as we can, to recognise the democratic mandate they have, and to play our part in helping them. But that crisis in London is huge, and I'm not quite sure what there are such big numbers and such big challenges and such big figures associated with the housing crisis in London. It is very difficult to kind of navigate a way through. But what is clear is we do need a significant expansion in the provision of housing in and around London if we're going to get anywhere close to getting our arms around the particular challenges that we have. I'm not sure whether that answers your point. Yeah, I'm not.
No, it was going to lead on to that next question, I guess, Ian, in regards to that homelessness and temporary accommodation. Because I just as the point that you said around speaking to one of the local London boroughs, I saw a study that had also noted that £50 million a month has been spent in temporary accommodation across all London boroughs. So, I mean, in your view, how could that money be better invested into long-term housing solutions?
Well, it's very difficult to imagine a worse way of spending the money. So if you go back to the 1970s, and I can give you the exact figures, but it was something of the order of 84% of housing that was spent on housing, so money rather that was spent on housing, was spent on bricks and mortar, and the rest was spent on revenue subsidies. If you take that to the present day, those figures have inverted completely. So 90% of money that's spent on housing is spent on temporary accommodation, on housing benefit, on propping up a system that doesn't work. We're spending billions keeping people in misery, and we're not generating any assets from that. We are simply keeping people housed in very unsatisfactory situations. Imagine if that was all redirected. And this is the challenge for government, actually, and I'm not suggesting this is easy. Because, of course, if you want to expand housing, there's a delay. It takes a while to build a home. And so there's a point at which you're paying both the revenue, but also the capital that's required in order to build the homes, to take that demand, to take the heat out of that demand. That's incredibly challenging, given that that's likely to be 5 years before you start realizing the benefit. And that doesn't sit comfortably with any term of office of a government. So I think it is a real challenge, and we've got ourselves into this situation because of the right to buy, which appeared to not have any negative impacts in the short term. But of course, it's an ecosystem. Ecosystems struggle over long periods of time, and the longer term effect of the right to buy has been that, plus not building as much housing as we need, plus a whole variety of other things that have gone on in terms of the housing market in the capital and investment.
And across the sector, and this is I guess a UK piece as well, Ian. You've seen it with the G15 as well, where development is being stripped back to focus on repairing existing homes. But clearly, there's Awab's Law, there's Decent Homes 2, I believe, on the horizon. Along with that, there's on average a 17% increase in the cost of a singular repair. So how do Peabody balance the books? Because naturally there is a need to still build to address the housing crisis, but you also have to look after your existing stock and bring that up to scratch. So how do you balance that?
Well, I'm not sure we are balancing it particularly well at the moment. We have decided that, our first call on resources has to be our existing stock. So we're going to spend £2 billion over the next 5 years on investing in our stock. That's building safety, but also the sort of general windows, bathrooms, kitchens, roofs, all of the basic asset management. And we're investing to make sure that our existing homes are where they need to be and that they're safe. And a lack of access, I have mentioned the lack of access to the Building Safety Fund for people living in social housing, actually, is a huge drain for somebody like us that has 257 blocks above 18 metres. It's an eye-watering sums of money that are going out in terms of building safety. So I think you do sadly have to be really clear. The year before last, we finished something like 2,299 homes, approximately. Last year it was 1,239, but this year we'll start 148. So that's a tenfold reduction and deceleration in what we're able to do. So at the very time when the capital need us, the capital need us it more than ever, we're going in the opposite direction, very sadly. So we're doing what we can. We're selling non-core assets. We're looking at different ways that we can restructure and support the organisation. We're looking at alternative streams of funding, joint ventures, so on and so forth, all of which will put some capacity back. But actually, the gulf at the moment is enormous. And, I think there are two separate issues that quite often get conflated. There's the sort of fundamental financial capacity of us as housing associations, and I think this is true of all G15. And actually, rent convergence, the rent settlement, access to building safety fund, all of those things are needed in order to generate to improve our fundamental capacity to contribute. And then there's the sort of scheme viability, which is a separate challenge, but actually requires public money to do that as well. So I really am an admirer of the ambition of the current government. I think that's absolutely right. I think they're hugely hamstrung in terms of what they can do and where the money's coming from.
I was going to say the rhetoric is great, isn't it? But it's kind of where does this money come from? And I guess just as a final question on that, Ian, before we get on to the quick fire questions, no pressure. The end is just I guess in London, social rents are about 50% of the market rate, and a 60-year timeline to cover that cost. So clearly, without answering my own question, it's clearly not sustainable. So as you look at government, the rhetoric's great, but what one policy change would make the biggest difference to housing providers in addressing the crisis in London?
It's to see housing as infrastructure. So if you build hospitals, if you build schools, then the benefits of that are recognised and understood by government. It is seen as the infrastructure which allows the rest of society to prosper. I think if you put housing on the same basis of that and change the fundamental mentality, saw it as investment in infrastructure and not debt on the public balance sheet, that everything kind of flows from that, really. So there are things, the mechanical things, rent convergence is a big one, access to building safety funds, long-term rent settlement. All of those things are really important. But actually, conceptually, we need to think of housing in a different way than perhaps we have at the outset.
Yeah, really interesting. Great. Thank you, Ian. I've really, really enjoyed this discussion. But as I said, before I let you go, some quick fire questions for you. What has been the most valuable leadership lesson you've learned?
Best thing anybody's ever said to me was David Bennett, who was the chief executive at Sanctuary, once said to me, it's never too late to pull out of a bad deal. So you just be self-aware, because sometimes you get sucked into things and you end up in it becoming more important that you cross the line than it is that to stand back and say, is this still the right thing to do? So yeah, that's probably the single best lesson I've ever learned.
It's a really interesting point. What advice would you give to an aspiring leader starting out on their journey?
Try and remain grounded. Be nice. You don't have to step on other people in order to get on in this life. It's a myth. And this is a nice sector. So we have a fantastic opportunity. We do good things, and we should never lose sight of that, the social mission that we're all on in housing. But also you get to do interesting kind of commercial stuff as well. So you do that with that very clear North Star of a social purpose. And I think it's a huge privilege to work in this sector, and we should rejoice about it.
Yeah.
We moan a lot,
without a shadow of doubt.
But
yeah, but we should also.
I moan a lot, but we should also be happy about where we are.
Brilliant. And what do you think of some of the key leadership qualities required in today's world?
So I think it's a bit like technology, right? So the rules of physics, the laws of physics, Newton's laws of physics don't change. The laws of good management don't change. They are eternal. They last forever. They're about bringing people on, bringing people through. The mechanics, the technological advances that we've made, none of those have changed the fundamental laws of physics, right? But they're different tools that we can use. So I think IT, the capacity of technology, all of those things that we are all coming to terms with, the self-serve, all of that, really important. But they don't change the fundamentals about good management, respect for individuals, motivation, clarity of purpose, being very clear about your objectives, and managing performance. All of those things remain and will remain into the indefinite future.
That's brilliant. Great. And on the point of management leadership, Ian, final question. What leadership book recommendation you give to the listeners?
Good to Great. Good to Great by somebody or other.
Jim Collins.
That's
Jim Collins. Yeah, it's a good one. It's a great one. Thank you. You'll be unsurprised to know, Ian, it's been referred to as by many chief execs in the sector on this podcast. So you're on for a good one.
Well, I want it to be a bit more unusual and different, but anyway, I failed. But that is, I think, and the case studies that wouldn't necessarily stand up today, but the fundamental principles that sit within that book are really insightful. And I've as somebody who doesn't read a lot, I've read it once and I've listened to it twice. So it's a really good listen.
Yeah,
or read.
It's a cracking audiobook, there's no doubt about it. There's Ian, thank you so much for joining us on the Housing Collective podcast. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Take care.